of manpower. They created foreign legion groups, but because those people were not Aryans, they couldn't be trusted. So they were put under the command of Henry Himmler, under command of SS, and became known as SS Waffen units. And one of such units was created in Ukraine.
The following is a conversation with Serhiy Plokhy, a historian at Harvard University and the director of the Ukrainian Research Institute, also at Harvard. As a historian, he specializes in the history of Eastern Europe, with an emphasis on Ukraine. He wrote a lot of great books on Ukraine and Russia, the Soviet Union, on Slavic peoples in general across centuries, on Chernobyl and nuclear disasters, and on the current war in Ukraine. A book titled The Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History. This is a Lex Friedman podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, dear friends, here's Serhiy Plokhy. What are the major explanations for the collapse of the Soviet Union? Maybe ones you agree with and ones you disagree with.
Very often people confuse three different processes that were taking place in the late 80s and early 90s. And the one was the collapse of communism as ideology. Another was the end of the Cold War. And the third one was the end of the Soviet Union. All of these processes were interrelated, interconnected. But when people provide ideology as the explanation for all of these processes, that's where I disagree. Because ideological collapse happened on the territory of the Soviet Union in general. Soviet Union lost the Cold War, whether we're talking about Moscow, Leningrad, or St. Petersburg now, or Vladivostok. But the fall of the Soviet Union is about a story in which Vladivostok and St. Petersburg ended up in one country, and Kiev, Minsk, and Duchanbe ended in different countries. So the theories and explanations about how did that happen, for me, these are really very helpful theories for understanding the Soviet collapse. So the mobilization from below, the collapse of the center, against the background of economic collapse, against the background of ideological implosion. That's how I look at the fall of the Soviet Union, and that's how I look at the theories that explain the collapse.
So it's a story of geography, ideology, economics. Which are the most important to understand of what made the collapse of the Soviet Union happen?
The Soviet collapse was unique, but not more unique than collapse of any other empire. So what we really witnessed, or the world witnessed back in 1991, and we continue to witness today with the Russian aggression against Ukraine, is a collapse of one of the largest world empires. We talked about the Soviet Union, and now talk about Russia as possessing plus minus 1/6 of the surface of the Earth. You don't get in possession of 1/6 of the Earth by being a nation state. You get that sort of size as an empire. And the Soviet collapse is continuation of the disintegration of the Russian Empire that started back in 1917. That was arrested for some period of time by the Bolsheviks, by the communist ideology, which was internationalist ideology, and then came back in full force in the late 80s and early 90s. So the most important story for me, this is the story of the continuing collapse of the Russian Empire and the rise of not just local nationalism, but also rise of Russian nationalism that turned out to be as a destructive force for the imperial or multi-ethnic, multinational state, as was Ukrainian nationalism or Georgian or Estonian for that matter.
Or we said a lot of interesting stuff though in 1917, Bolsheviks, internationalists, how that plays with the idea of Russian Empire and so on. But first let me ask about U.S. influence on this. So one of the ideas is that, through the Cold War, that mechanism, U.S. had major interest to weaken the Soviet Union, and therefore the collapse could be attributed to pressure and manipulation from the United States. There's a truth to that.
The pressure from the United States, this is part of the Cold War. The Cold War part of that story, but it doesn't explain the Soviet collapse. And the reason is quite simple. The United States of America didn't want the Soviet Union to collapse and disintegrate. They didn't want that at the start of the Cold War in 1948. We now have the strategic documents. They were concerned about that. They didn't want to do it, and certainly they didn't want to do it in the year 1991. As late as August of 1991, the month of the coup in Moscow, President Bush, George H.W. Bush, travels from Moscow to Kiev and gives famous speech called Chicken Kiev speech, basically warning Ukrainians against going for independence. The Soviet collapse was a huge headache for the administration in the White House for a number of reasons. They liked to work with Gorbachev. The Soviet Union was emerging as a junior partner of the United States in the international arena. Collapse was destroying all of that. And on the top of that, there was the question of the nuclear weapons, unaccounted nuclear weapons. So the United States was doing everything humanly possible to keep the Soviet Union together in one piece until really late November of 1991, when it became clear that it was a lost cause and they had to say goodbye to Gorbachev and to the project that he introduced. A few months later, a year later, there was a presidential campaign, and Bush was running for the second term and was looking for achievements, and there were many achievements.